Hi everyone, it's really nice to have such a huge attendance today for our panel about building a strong deep tech ecosystem. And I have to say it will be more building strong deep tech ecosystems because we have a panel that has a lot of experience all over the world, and it will be a really, really interesting insights. We'll go into how ecosystems have evolved in the last few years, also the challenges that they are still facing, and of course we'll discuss solutions because we have a very various backgrounds here today around the table. So I'll let the speakers shortly introduce themselves, and maybe we'll start with you, Louis.
Thank you very much. I'm Louis Fleuret, Deputy Director at the French Tech Mission, which is an administration in the French Ministry of Economy, working for the Minister Noël Barrot, which was there already. So our job is to support the French tech ecosystem, very quickly.
Hi, I'm Andra Keay, and I'm the Deep Tech Lead for IEEE Entrepreneurship, which is the largest professional association in the world of computer scientists and engineers. But that's my weekend hat. My daytime job is I'm the Managing Director of Silicon Valley Robotics, which is the largest ecosystem of robotics startups in the world, and VP of Global Robotics for the Association of Manufacturing Technology, and founder of Women in Robotics, which is an area of passion for me.
Hello, I'm Patrick Rouvillois. I'm the head of the Natixis CIB Tech Hub. We are a new team in Natixis helping companies to accelerate in new tech, from startups to funds and what we call tech-accelerated companies.
Good morning, I'm Kerry Baldwin. I'm co-founder and managing partner of IQ Capital. We're a deep tech early stage VC investing from as small as $500,000 all the way up to 30 million in outperforming deep tech companies. I've been in venture capital for 25 years now, and I was also chair of the British Private Equity and Venture Capital Association.
Thanks for being here. My name is Constantijn van Oranje. I lead TechLeap, which is basically the Dutch variety of La French Tech. And we help companies through programs. We help the government through removing barriers to tech entrepreneurs. And together we're trying to make the Netherlands a much more interesting place to do business.
So you see, I wasn't lying about the depth of expertise we have around the panel. And I'm Alizée Blanchin. I'm the head of consulting for Hello Tomorrow. And I'm not going to introduce Hello Tomorrow because I hope you know who we are if you're here. So, I mean, today the ecosystem have grown. We have 90% of fundings overall in the world that are allocated to deep tech. We have governments that have been taking a stand. You can see it with also, for instance, in France, BPI France creating the deep tech part of their programs locally and at the state level. You have universities such as A-Star in Singapore that are pushing their scientists with KPIs around spinning off their innovations with corporate or private partners. So we're getting to a stage where maturity is starting to show. But it's not always been the case. And I wanted to introduce and start the panel with a bit of reflection on the past 10 years, because a lot has been done. And so maybe we can start with Europe, since that's where we are. We are not the first ones to start, but we've grown a lot. And especially there's been a lot of interest from states that are growing. So maybe Louis or Constantijn, can you tell us about how you've seen this market growing?
Yeah, I think, so what we've seen recently, because of the war in Ukraine, because of COVID, the American position towards China and all that came out of that, we're seeing a much stronger attention for tech in general and startups because of this, we call it it's autonomy, right? We think that strategic autonomy is really important, much more important. We've seen that our supply chains are very vulnerable. So we're seeing a lot of kind of activities now of governments trying to support more tech development in their countries, but also make sure that supply chains are kind of returning back and manufacturing comes back to Europe. So I think we're seeing that globally, but that has given a real push for, I don't know if this smoke is supposed to...
It is.
But bye guys. And it's been very helpful. We've also seen a lot of public money going into the system. So in the Netherlands, for instance, we have the 20 billion growth fund. We have deep tech funds, all these kind of things that weren't there before. And people have coined deep tech, and that's easy because it was high tech and hardware, and people are talking about different things now. Deep tech is the thing. Everybody's throwing a lot of money at it, and I think what's the real challenge is to make that money work productively. So we've seen that, and especially the public money.
And so we're talking about public, so I think for the French tech, you can tell us a bit about the journey also you've seen throughout Europe and France.
I think that in France and in Europe, 10 years ago, we have a change of mind because we all decided that the future of our economy, of our jobs, will come from innovation. It may sound very simple today, but 10 years ago, I think that Europe was more about competition, and now, 10 years ago, we decided to put a lot of money, a lot of talent, a lot of process about visa and other things to accelerate innovation, because we are persuaded that our future of economy will come from the tech sector. It started with more digital startups 10 years ago, and maybe 4 or 5 years ago we have a second change of mind with the deep tech that emerged from public laboratories, and so we decided to put more funds on deep tech startups. I think we close in France the first decade of the French tech plan this year, which was more about digital startups, and now we open the new decade more about the deep tech one.
Awesome. And Kerry, I know, when we are talking about financing, you have a lot to say, right? So I think digital was also at the forefront of what VCs were investing in, and now we see more and more funds opening toward deep tech, gaining expertise. So can you tell us also how you've been seeing this VC landscape evolving in the last 10 years?
Yeah, so I'd say over the last 10 years, technology and generally a lot of statistics were just looping technology all together. But what we've seen recently is we're able to differentiate what was actually deep tech. So those statistics where you look at, let's say in 2015, only less than 5 billion in Europe was invested into what we term as deep tech companies. You see over the last 2 years, Europe investing over 53 billion into the deep tech companies. Now how that's split is you've got 30 billion from the EU countries, but you've got 17 billion from the UK. Now we look at the UK and how has that ecosystem really developed? First of all, you had the British Patient Capital and British Business Bank that invested into so many new funds in the sort of late 2000s. And what we've seen is you've got many, many companies and funds that are on their third, fourth fund, just producing excellent top decile returns. But on top of that, they looked at what can we do and where are the funding gaps. And you see in the UK, the Future Fund Breakthrough, which is that Series B deep tech scaling gap for those scale-up companies. And just building on what you said as well, what I have seen, because I consult quite a lot of governments from Singapore to the Middle East and several European territories, what we've seen here is we've seen that the governments have become more strategic in what are they trying to address. So a lot of these governments have quantum strategies. They have defense. They have strategic advantage strategies. And this has produced to the ecosystem really strong leadership in where to go. And what I've noticed that has changed massively is the governments in all the territories are leaning into both the founders and the funds and saying, how can we produce digital strategies? Just building on what you're saying here. So what we have in Europe are pockets of incredibly strong ecosystems, which we'll probably touch on later. And I think this is what's propelling it. The UK has always had that really strong angel initial EIS, which has really propelled those early deep tech companies, having investors that will really take that risk early on. And I think that we're going to see more and more of those measures rolled out throughout Europe.
And it's interesting what you're saying, because for funding, we think about the US a lot. But actually, I was seeing some stats about the investment in Europe growing 3 times faster than what they are growing in the US. So I think really this dynamic that we are building is taking shape and is going to keep on moving forward. And so moving forward with the US, Andra, I think Silicon Valley is seen as a very dynamic, very innovative ecosystem with a very specific mindset. Can you tell us, in your opinion, what has changed, but also what is Silicon Valley doing differently from elsewhere in terms of building its ecosystem?
I really want to reflect on what Kerry said about you have to differentiate. And one of the things that happens is that people assume that, for example, I'm in deep tech in Silicon Valley, and they think that that means Silicon Valley style investment. And those are two separate things. There was zero investment, more or less, if we're talking billion-dollar terms, into deep tech 10, 12 years ago. And that's gone up to 30 billion in robotics alone. Well, that's a global figure in the last couple of years. But of that, 1/3 is coming from the Silicon Valley area. That is a significant change. I used to go into VC gatherings, gate crash them, and say, you know, robotics is going to have a moment. It's really coming into its own. We're starting to see this in hardware, and robotics is just riding on all of these technological and economic drivers. And I can see these startups, and I see these startups, and they need funding. And the VCs are going, no, forget about it. This is not us, we don't want to know. So one of the things there is we've seen a huge change just in 10 years in terms of what Silicon Valley funds. And by and large, it's not the traditional VC funds that are funding deep tech. It is a lot of first-time funds. And it's a lot of new funds that are growing really strongly on the back of their commitment to deep tech. I mean, who was talking Tiger Global or Eclipse 10 years ago, for example? But the other thing that I think is really different from the Silicon Valley or the US perspective, because if you're in the East Coast of the US, this is very different to the West Coast of the US. The East Coast of the US is far closer to government strategies or regional state strategies. The West Coast is like, hello, I think there's strategies in the government over there somewhere, but we don't see it on the ground.
Really interesting. And it's funny because when we were also prepping the panel, you were telling me that, yes, there are more and more funds that are going into deep tech, but there is also more and more interest from banks in the US, but elsewhere. And Patrick, I know you have been able to work toward the APAC region. You operate also in the US and in Europe. So can you tell us a bit about how the role of banking has evolved also in taking risks with deep tech, and maybe also how what you've seen in APAC can be a bit different from what we already discussed?
Yes, indeed. APAC in the last, I would say, even 20 years, have seen a very fast-moving, changing landscape in terms of innovation. Mobile and everything which was on mobile came from Asia, basically 25 years ago, with what happened in Japan and then Korea. One has to say that nowadays, most of the innovation on mobile is actually coming mostly from the US and obviously Europe as well, and China as well. What has actually happened in the last is the growth of China and mobile, and the very strong digital ecosystem of China has, invested heavily in new cutting-edge technologies, what we call deep tech now. If you look, for example, at the amount of IP that has been developed in China alone, it's really striking to see the amount of patents that actually been created over there. So obviously AI now becomes more mainstream. You can still claim it's deep tech, but obviously ChatGPT now is making headlines everywhere. So we have really seen China, investing in the long term and having now strong positions. Obviously, the question now becomes, more geopolitical questions around China. What does that mean? How is that going to be evolving? And a strong push as well, obviously, on, I wouldn't call that deep tech, though, crypto and blockchain was probably considered deep tech a few years ago. But all the crypto and blockchain ecosystem has developed very strongly in Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore. And we see now a strong push in Southeast Asia on everything digital and including deep tech as well. Obviously, the role of the banks, to answer your other question, is quite critical in funding those companies, creating links with them, also incorporating those cutting-edge innovation in our ecosystem, and I think that what has happened in blockchain, and I would say nowadays even more tokenization, is a very strong signal that we are in fact embracing that change. For many years, I would say financial services have been very stable. Online banks and mobile banking has been created a few years ago, but that has been well absorbed, I would say, by traditional financial institutions. With blockchain and tokenization, I think it's another wave where we need to actually accelerate on that. So it's at the same time, a key element of our own transformation as an industry, and definitely a key element of how we need to help the ecosystem and our clients.
And so we've been discussing already financing as one of the challenge. I think it's one of the key, anyway, things that startup needs. When we survey startups every year at Hello Tomorrow, it's always #1 concern, just before market access. And there is this gray zone when you're a founder, you're in a lab, you get subsidies, and then you want to launch your startup. You're not big enough, you're not making money, so for traditional and old-style VCs, maybe you're not attractive yet. And we were discussing with all of you guys how those new VCs are going also earlier in the chain, so pre-seed, seed. And Kerry, I would like to come back to you because you were telling me they're new, so maybe you have good advice as of how they need to operate, like to focus, to really be able to make a difference for the ecosystem and for startups.
So for new first-time funds that are approaching deep tech, if you're going at that pre-product phase and that seed phase, you really need to understand first of all, you have to have an amazing relationship with that founder and the wider team. So make sure, so one thing that I always do is I don't just focus on the founder. I spend a lot of time with the other people in the organization that are going to make the difference. It could be a product problem, so I'll sit with the head of product and really ride that roadmap and check to competitive intelligence where that roadmap is going. If it's a company that's obviously got to start laying the ground or the narrative or educating the market as to this technology is coming and you may want to use it, you need to start really focusing on your MarTech and your MarTech stack. And a lot of academic founders in the labs don't necessarily focus on marketing, or they have to educate a market. So I spend a lot of time saying, get your MarTech in order. That means when you're ready for your Series A and your Series B, those investors are going to look at slightly more traditional metrics. And it's always a bit too late to suddenly go, oh, I've now got to put my MarTech stack in order. So I spend a lot of time doing that as well. But another thing that is absolutely critical for the first-time founders is the governance. We are venture capitalists. We're representing our LPs' money. And therefore, we have to make sure that we're putting strong governance inside these companies. Now, it may be very early, but governance means making sure that all the risk registers are kept together. You've got audit committees. You've got all the regulations, the REMCOs. Because what happens with these deep tech early-stage companies is they can suddenly get an approach to be acquired. And what goes wrong during that sudden early phase is they come in and look at all the books and look at the order, and it's not in order, and that slowly chips away at the price. So getting good governance into those companies early. The other thing, which is absolutely critical, is making sure that you are the right fund for that company. No matter how tempting or how hype or how exciting it is, if you do not have the expertise to guide that company through the challenges, or you don't have the connections to bring in the right non-exec directors, or the right advice that company needs there and then, or access to those corporates, or if they're in cyber, let's say, do you really have access to lots of CISOs so they can start working out with the customers what the product market fit would be? If you don't, you're not the right VC for that company. And you should really focus and be backing where you are in your right lane. And obviously, look at the capital that that company is going to need. And if you don't have the allocation strategies in place and you don't have sufficient capital, you are the wrong fund. Because you won't make great returns if you can't follow on. And remember, we are in deep tech. Now, deep tech doesn't always go to plan. So therefore, you always have to be allocating and making sure that you've got enough to see these companies through what can be challenging moments. So those would be my openers. Governance, making sure you're the right fund, making sure you have the right connections and introductions for that company. And then, of course, with these founders, they've always got to be thinking, who is the next fund that's going to be investing, and making friends early in that space. Have I done enough customer evidence? Are these customers going to say, yeah, this is needed, even if we don't have revenues yet? Are the customers on those calls when you phone up in diligence going to back that founder and say, yeah, we're looking at this, it's progressing well, we want to go here? But you've got to really, really, really make sure that you're in touch with that market and always think about who are my references for every single round when you don't have traditional SaaS metrics, let's say. That would be my opener.
I have a question on that.
Tell me.
Yeah, when would you advise a team to start talking to an investor?
Well, I spoke about this last night. So I told off a lot of the late stage VCs in the room last night and said, please can you stop wasting my time for my portfolio companies? So that for a founder should always be keeping an eye on who would be the best company or the best VC to guide at the next stage, and they should build that relationship early. Now, what that does not mean is when a big late-stage VC comes into my founders at a very early stage, it's obviously they're still figuring out product market fit, and then waste a month of their time, because this founder gets excited, this massive fund wants to invest in me. It ties up and takes up a whole month of my CEO's time and their wider team, only to be told, well, come back to us in a year's time. Well, I was nearly said to swear. That was obvious, so let's not do that. But the founders should be making connections with those late stages all the time, saying, what metrics will you be looking at? If my product looks like this, what do you think? And I do with a lot of my startups very early when I know which fund I want them to be taking in. I say, if it's a RevOps model, let's say, I'll say, give me one of your best RevOps experts in your portfolio to make sure that I'm setting up my RevOps inside my company to the way you look at it. So when you plug in to my system, it's as you want it for your diligence. If it's a product problem, I'll ask the later stage funds for, show me what you're going to measure this company on. And founders can do that. Founders can do that. But be very careful up front. When are you going to be investing? And just don't eat up your team's time for a whole month of diligence and get excited. So early as you can, but be very mindful. And keep it tracked. Do you know how many VCs, founders, don't track with proper sheets every interaction with a VC? When they spoke to them, what was the question? What was the problem? Because when you come back to Series B, Series C, you're probably going to be speaking to those funds again and say, I remember when you asked this, we solved that. You gave me a great piece of advice, we solved that. Just track it all. Be disciplined.
That's excellent advice and a great question, because I agree, you should be talking to VCs as early as you know, from the lab onwards. But what you need to do is not just talk. You need to investigate and qualify who you're talking to. Understand, is this person an actual partner? Do they write the check? Do they have decision-making power? Or are they an associate who is effectively paid to go out there and create as many relationships as possible? That's not going to do you any good. And to track, to understand who you're talking to, what value this could be. There is no harm in talking to a later stage VC if they would be on your roadmap moving forward. But there is a lot of wasted time talking to a zillion and one associates for funds that are not going to form part of your future.
Right, I'm going to intervene on that one. Right, you love a bit of controversial. So I would say find the person in the VC that has the best experience, yeah, especially in deep tech. Now, that isn't always the managing partners. So you all know my background, yeah? But I'm the best person at scaling, competitive intelligence, getting you through those stages, getting all of that. But I'm not the expert in my team in space. I'm not the expert in my team in AI and machine learning models, right? So if that is an analyst or if it's an associate, it's a principal, go to that person first, because that person has to love you. And that person within inside your team is going to champion you the whole way through as the partners get involved. So maybe it's a slight difference here, but I would say go to the person on that team that will get your proposition, because they will champion you. And at the right point, if it's the right kind of VC, all eyes are on that proposition. So I'm looking at those companies in terms of competitive intelligence, scaling, who's going to exit, how are we going to grow that company, customer, messaging. Whereas my deep tech awesome team, even though they might not be the general partner, they're fantastic because they'll be championing you. They'll know the wider market. So I would say, slightly controversially to that one, don't be afraid of speaking with the associates if they are the expert and they're going to get your sector.
You're not contradicting each other. I mean, I think, no, it's just you should not talk to somebody who doesn't have any benefit for you, right? So
Exactly. Sorry, no controversy.
Okay, well, I was just picking up
bad
on
luck.
the analysts. I was just picking
Good
on the
try.
analysts. Analysts are just, some of them are amazing. So, I'm going to stand up for the analysts.
But it's qualifying, isn't it? I mean, how exciting is it when you get venture capital interest in what you're doing and you fall all over yourselves and you don't ask them questions. And yet, if you're going into any other relationship, you would want to know, what is this going to benefit for us? How much are we committing? And how is this going to give anything back to us? And you have to really have that mindset with everything. And it's effectively, it's customer development methodology. And this is going to serve you in good purpose when you're starting to do the same thing to explore your market.
And I'm going to build on that question to you, Patrick, because when is the good time to go speak to banks then?
Interesting question, especially in the context of the last 24 hours and the news around SVB. So indeed, a bank can be obviously a critical partner from the very beginning, just to have proper accounts, and that's always a good start. We are very dense in France in Groupe PPCE, with Banque Populaire, Caisse d'Épargne, so we have plenty of companies in deep tech who are actually banked in the group. So that's obviously a first step. The question becomes, obviously, once you've raised money, a lot of the question is, when can you actually put that on a startup? Well, the criteria typically is, you need to have a positive EBITDA, and that could be quite far away for many, many companies. So then there's all the questions of how you can do venture debt, and again, I refer to you, have a look at what's happening with SVB. It's a challenging kind of business, but there's a lot of funds actually being there. There is also an interest from, I would say, European banks to step into that area. If you have actual assets, and that can be factories, that can be infrastructure you deploy, that's really something where a bank can help for sure as well. Because you have securities as a bank that you can rely on for those kinds of funding. Obviously, what a bank can bring as well goes well beyond that. That's covering everything which goes from management packages, payment, that goes as well to once you have been successful, wealth management as well. So the bank is very much, a key partner in helping you at the beginning, navigating a bit what's happening in the finance environment. Also, connecting with some investors is quite a critical element. I would say that banks in Europe, obviously in the US, there's many banks. I won't talk about SVB, but they were indeed a very, very critical player and are still. So. Banks are critical. Talk to your bankers as quickly, as early as possible. Educate yourself about what are the various levers that can be put in place. Often you are going to hire, a CFO which may not have all the experience, but you need to upgrade your team as well on the financial side as you grow. That's typically what a bank can bring.
Maybe if I can disagree just a little bit for the debate, I think that no entrepreneur creates startups to raise funds. Raise funds is to achieve another goal, and I think the very simple question is why do you want to create deep tech startups? And maybe after 5 years of your deep tech startups, you have to ask yourself again, why do I created these startups? Because I think a lot of startups are created to respond to societal issues. It's not every deep tech startup, but a lot of startups are about global warming, about health issues, and I think that the mistake would be that deep tech is a new funny thing, and so because everybody are going to deep tech now, researchers or students have to create deep tech startups. I think that we have global issues, and we need a new idea, new innovation, and that means deep tech. And this is why the European Union and European states put a lot of money. It's not our money. Our LPs are the people, because we invest with tax money. And so there is a why I want to create my deep tech startups, and why the state want to support these startups. And I'm convinced that entrepreneurs don't create their startup to raise money, but deep tech startups are a way to respond to global issues. And I think in a way this is like a democratic matter to me, because if we don't define the technology, we don't define how we want to respond to these global issues. And if we create innovation about AI, do we analyze the environmental impact or not? If we create new health tech innovation, can the state finance for people the use of these technologies? So I think that entrepreneurs in deep tech have a responsibility, because it's not only in a way about their startups, it's about how in France or in Netherlands or in Europe we can choose how we want to respond to global issues.
Can I respond to that? I mean, I agree to a certain degree, but I think we choose the capitalist system to make that impact happen. So sometimes we get into this discussion about, you know, how can private people, private individuals become wealthy on the back of public investments. And you see this in science, scientists commercializing, and then you have the scientist with the big car, and there's a lot of jealousy against that. So I do think we have to start talking also to the people, to the taxpayers, and saying, well, this is our choice. We are not the state that's going to procure all these innovations. The large companies are not going to procure or license all those new technologies. We need startups, and if they are successful, we should celebrate them. And success also means making money. And if you want to make more impact, you're going to grow faster, you're going to make more money, and that money can then you do something that you do brilliantly in the UK with the EIS. You make sure that the money plows back into the system. But what we see is that people try to spin out a technology. And it's all nice when you're a little startup and stuff. But then when you start getting successful, everybody wants to first start to grab a piece of the pie. So it's the universities, and actually in the Netherlands we had a breakthrough that all the universities signed a standard term sheet template. So and that really reduces the time of negotiation, and that's been really good. But so first they try to grab a piece of the pie, and then if you're really successful, they start to, you become the commercial, not ethical, I don't know what scientist or other in your peer group. And that's something I think we should really battle against. I think we should celebrate that success. We should stimulate those people to bring their talent and their understanding and their capital back into the system, and so that they can grow the system altogether. But I have these conversations, and I don't know what it is, but you find it in government, you find it in academia, is that we just don't acknowledge that the capital system is there to also, make money, and that impact alone is not going to be sufficient if you can't grow it, if you can't make a good business out of it.
Yeah, how would you say, the opposite of success is not actually failure, it's entropy. It's stagnation. It's continuing with status quo because you don't want to take risks. And I think that's the inherent point of success for the capitalist system in driving rapid change rather than necessarily slow, cautious change that is taking all of the factors into account. But I see this primarily, I have a robotics background, and so of course people believe that robots steal jobs. What actually takes jobs is companies failing because they are no longer productive. So far more jobs are lost when companies shut down than are lost when individual positions may be lost as a company expands with automation or with innovation. So use robots as an avatar for innovation. So 1 or 2 jobs are lost when you adopt innovation, but you become more productive, you expand operations, you hire more people, you expand, and everybody is winning. Where you lose is not failure. It is stagnation and inability to compete and grow. And that's where capitalism has a little bit of the edge, because it's not selective. It leaves people behind, and that's bad, but it encourages rapid growth.
Yes, I think it's quite an important point. If you look back at the internet, several of us, I guess, were involved in tech. In my case, was 30 years ago in Lawrence Livermore Lab, which is a national lab in the US. That was definitely, coming from, that was deep tech. Internet was deep tech 30 years ago. AI was deep tech 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So what is deep tech tomorrow, in fact, will be mainstream, in a few years. And we see that, and the whole dynamic that has been at play is indeed, it's not consensus building. It's indeed, it's pure creative destruction. You create something. Internet developed against, the AOL, and in France against the Minitel, and against, some government policies in some cases, and has been extremely successful. So I think that's a key dynamic that we need to maintain. If I look at the ecosystem then, in particular in Europe, I think it's a critical element for governments to create an ecosystem in Europe that is at European scale. Very difficult today. You are a startup, you want to have 10 people in 10 different geographies, or you want to spread your team across 5 countries in Europe. It's a nightmare. Social laws, tax, all of that is not set at all for actually an ecosystem that is as successful as what it is still in the US, because indeed the US is still the innovative machine, particularly the Silicon Valley, on those topics.
By accident. Honestly, it is by accident. There are no policies, being controversial here, that the US has to prop up its innovation. The visa policies are completely broken. We are getting rid of the talented people that are creating the innovations faster than we're in growing them locally or bringing them into the country. There is so much wrong with the US ecosystem. What works for it is that it has assembled a certain critical amount of mass, and that continues to grow and to breed. The innovation is coming from the innovative community that it had created. And the roots for that go back 50, 60 years or more. It goes back to Silicon Valley originally being the home of a lot of Defense Force-funded innovation around deep tech, around World War II.
And I want to pick up on that part about policy, because we talked a lot about funding and the role of VCs, of banks. The state also plays a pretty big role in financing, but not only, right? When we're talking about jobs, about talents, there is a lot to be done. And there is also a lot to be done in terms of attractivity, of awareness about deep tech in general, about startups to be able to grow and scale and gain traction. So I think, Louis, Constantijn, you both have been quite involved in what has been done by the different states in Europe to be able to provide programs, visibility, fundings, and talent. Can you tell us a bit your insights on what's working and maybe what's not?
Yeah, I think we typically say we want to create ecosystems. I personally don't believe in that. I do think that the government can set certain parameters, and within those parameters you have to basically stay out. But governments then tend to lean in and want to do business support and want to do all kinds of things that you should actually leave to entrepreneurs themselves. For what has worked really well for us is to create a community of entrepreneurs where we get peer learning going, and what in the end you would like to achieve is a flywheel whereby the next generation of entrepreneurs is mentored by the former generation, and that generation becomes the venture capitalists or the angel investors, or maybe they become repeat entrepreneurs, especially in deep tech, where I think if you have repeat entrepreneurs that are in the scientific system, that know how to maneuver the system, those people are extremely valuable. So nurture those. I think governments typically, because they are monopolists on power and they have a lot of money, they want to buy time. So they think by putting a lot of money in, suddenly things will happen. I think a lot of public money, if you don't structure it well, can corrupt as well, because it crowds out private money. And in the end, if you want that flywheel going, it's really the government that through fiscal stimuli, like in the UK, and with some support, obviously, there's some kind of part of the funding chain in the early stage where non-dilutive public money can help. But I would always caution governments, to want to be too interventionist And except for if there's a very strategic market and you need masses of capital, then, I mean, we've seen it with Tesla, for instance, that starting money, you know, they spend a lot of money in, but also what we then forget is to change the regulation that goes along with it. For instance, in Europe, we talk a lot about creating companies and we regulate. It's like there's nothing in the middle. But for instance, all of the medical devices companies, you know, everyone is here, will know how hard it is to get anything certified. So the medical devices directive is something, it is killing companies. And so we basically, we can have any policy, any money going in that industry, whatever we want. But if it's so much easier to get certified in the US by the FDA, I would advise every company go to the US. The market is bigger, you know, and you have much better policies. So in that we can do much more. And I think when we are protecting our consumers, we are never thinking also about, you know, how we are protecting the future technologies, innovation. So to have some kind of an understanding of how you can stay innovative while you're regulating and keep that in balance, I think is really important. And it's often not branded as innovation or ecosystem policy, but it actually is, sometimes can have much more impact than the actual policies, you know, of putting a lot of money in the system.
Definitely.
And I think that the first idea is that innovation and startup will not come from the state. And I really think that the state have to create the parameters that you evoke, but we don't want to choose innovation. We cannot choose. We are not investor. We are not entrepreneurs. So we always have the question: where do we have to stop to intervene? And it's difficult because 10 years ago, in the digital support policy, we support every digital innovation. We don't choose. And with deep tech now, every state wonder, do I have to intervene in the cyber sector, in the AI? How do I put public money? Because we need to have a strategy and focus on certain kind of technologies, but we don't want to replace entrepreneur or investor, and that's why what we do in France, we try. It's very simple to ask entrepreneur and investor, and it's very basic, but we have a network of 100 private association of entrepreneurs in France and abroad, and we ask them what do we need in terms of public support, and sometimes they don't take public support, and it's a good answer. So the idea is what can we create in terms of parameters to support their startups. For example, we create the French Tech Visa, which is one of the most open visa in the world, because it's a state issue, but people don't come in France because of a visa process. They come in France because we have starters, because maybe a quality of life, and so it's always difficult in a way for the state to choose where to intervene and where to not intervene. And I think the visa it's a good example. And we created some support program for startups. For example, we want to accelerate green startups, and so we selected the most promising Robotics startup in France, and we asked them what can we do. And sometimes they can sell to public buyers, so we try to buy their solution. Sometimes they have a public problem, so we try to help them, but we always work for startups, and we define our action with their needs in a way.
Perhaps this is a controversial point, but we're talking about building ecosystems. I would like to from my perspective, government support, public support is not an essential factor for doing this. Certainly, for example, women in robotics, building that ecosystem is entirely grassroots. Building Silicon Valley Robotics, we were started by robotics companies to support emerging startups. And no one in government in their right mind wants to give money to tech in Silicon Valley. And yet at the same time, robotics was not an invested area there was no actual support. But that forced us to be very agile and to walk the same walk as startups were walking. When you have no funding, no support from outside, how do you go about growth? And that was a very important lesson for us. It took us much closer to the heart of what we were doing and forced us to also be very agile. And if you study the history of ecosystems, then the ecosystems that we have supporting startups today are very different to the ecosystems that were supporting startups 10 years ago and 10 years before that. So it's an evolving field. The definition of ecosystem is continually changing, and I think it's very important to recognize that. And that is potentially a problem with large-scale or state support, is that it is probably, takes years to develop the playbook, and then you are stuck with the playbook that you develop.
And one thing that we discussed as well, Andra, when we were discussing ecosystem in Silicon Valley was the proximity with universities and tech transfer offices and then corporates, VCs, all being together. And we mentioned jobs, we mentioned how we can help entrepreneurs grow, but who is shaping the next entrepreneurs? It's the universities, right? That's where they're coming from. And they probably have a really important role in the future as well. So maybe can you give us an insight on what do you think universities can do right, and how can they maybe rethink a bit the tech transfer system that's not always working for deep tech startups?
It's rarely working. And the reality is that almost no university makes money from tech transfer. So why they should want to hold out for it, it just kills the startup. There was a great discussion yesterday on the Deep Tech Academy stage about exactly this. And I think entirely, I loved what Constantijn was saying about what the Netherlands have done, because we need like a safe note, but for tech transfer. We need a standardized agreement that is frictionless, that if a university, in fact, was at University of Waterloo, was an example yesterday, takes no equity, because successful entrepreneurs will gift back to the ecosystem of the university. And that is a far greater value than failing a lot of your startups in the hope that you're going to get 20% or even 10% of that one successful startup. Stanford is an exception, perhaps, and Silicon Valley is always a bit of an exception when we look at the universities. But my reality in Silicon Valley is I deal with all of the startups that don't have university support. And that is perhaps the majority of them. So it's great to have the Stanfords and Berkeleys in our ecosystem. They provide this much support. But we have to do a lot to provide support for the others. And I really like being able to provide an ecosystem that is agnostic to the university that you're in or to the venture funding that you may have received.
And you mentioned, so not all of the startups have the support of universities, and it's actually a topic we were discussing with you, Constantijn, because you were saying they can turn to programs, but sometimes there are so many programs. First, it's hard to choose, and then not all of them are actually providing the right things to startup to grow. So if you were to advise our crowd here about how to build a real good program that brings value to entrepreneurs, and maybe how to pick when you're an entrepreneur, what would it be?
Yes, yeah. Actually, maybe I just want to say a few things about the deal terms. It took us a long time. There was a lot of resistance, and it was a process. I think of in the end, it's 6 years. It wasn't a defined process, but there was at a certain point there was a momentum, and we grabbed the momentum. And lucky enough, quite a number of universities also saw that the bureaucracy and the lack of trust between the scientists and the founders and the institution basically just caused a lot of time loss, and that there is efficiency and transparency. So it's not an ideal situation, but it's good. You know, it's a starting point where we can start learning and creating a culture. That would be my second point. It's not so much about all these institutions, but it's about culture. I think why is Stanford so successful? Is because the professor is also a VC, and the student, becomes an entrepreneur, and later on maybe becomes a professor again. Everybody knows each other, and there's no bad thing in exchanging contacts and supporting each other on the business side as well. So there's a culture that supports that. And so it's so much easier to meet an entrepreneur, to meet a VC, to meet whatever kind of contact you know, if you're in that context. And in our universities in Europe are very secluded, so those systems don't exist around it, and it's culturally much more difficult, and you don't get rewarded for it. So if you are a successful scientist and you also have a successful business and university thinks that is great, and your students reward you for it, then that is going to be so much more stimulating to start businesses than all these programs. But to come to the programs, I think they are very, very good because they raise awareness, and they provide an environment where you can meet your peers. I think quite often the university have too few startups of a certain kind that they, to keep them in that localization. Maybe health, health, biotech, that you have, that basically you've got many of those, and you find them in all the universities. But when it becomes more specific, like robotics or stuff, you might want to not be just with your university. You want to look for the people that are like you. So why stay in that geography? If you have something good, maybe go to where there's a concentration of companies that do similar things and where there is actually an ecosystem. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have to be creative. If your market is not around the corner, you have to go where the market is. And these incubators or accelerators typically don't want to do that because they want to keep you there in that locality. And then programs are great. I think what we lack, this is the Netherlands, I don't know if it's in other cultures as well, we lack tough love. So we are too nice to our entrepreneurs, and the market is going to be tougher than any kind of mentor is going to be. So if you let companies go on because they have this wonderful technology that they're falling in love with, but actually there is no market they can go to, then we should have that conversation much earlier. So if there's one word that I would like to give to every accelerator or incubator is have a lot of tough love sessions early on in the process and help those entrepreneurs to understand that in the end it's a market problem that you have to solve, and not a technology problem.
And this also applies to VCs. I agree with all of that. And this applies to VCs. Our job is to produce dragons and hunt dragons. That's one investment that pays back the whole fund. Now, my fund one, I had a double dragon. But what that means is you're looking constantly at your allocation strategies. And those companies that clearly aren't going to end up being massive outperformers, you have to behave correctly with them in time. And most of these companies, because they're deep tech, and we're all deep tech investors here, they have strong IP at the core. And it's knowing when to sell those companies for a 1, 3x, a bit of your money back. That's fine. But you're hunting for dragons. Now, dragons is different to unicorns. And what we mustn't do is put off some of these founders who have great businesses, but they won't be a unicorn. And they will have great exits at 50, 150 million. And these come back, as you're saying, and re-educate the market. They come up with their next one, they come up with their next plan, they come up with their next venture, and they all come back into the market and the money's reinvested. This is really important. You're hunting dragons, not always unicorns.
Thank you for that last piece of advice. And unfortunately, our time is up, but I want to thank the panel because it's such a broad topic. I think we could get going for 2 hours, to be honest. We tried to touch upon funding, universities, the role of the state, a bit of talents as well. But if you have more questions and you want to discuss, I'm sure you can reach out to our speakers here to get more insights. And I thank you guys for your attention.